Greetings, Prof. MTH. I found your answer on suicide quite interesting because it differs considerably from my view. It's also quite interesting how synchronicity seems to work, because I found a similar article on the BBC site when I was looking at the news. I'll put a link up in the sidebar for that. I would argue that if a person wants to end their own life, then that should be their choice. I certainly believe that if somebody has a terminal disease or they're in a great deal of pain with no prospect of recovery, then they should have the option of ending that suffering. And I think that if there was a support infrastructure available to help people commit suicide if they wanted to, then this would have several advantages. I mean, number one would be that there'd be fewer splashy, nasty messes for some other poor unfortunate to have to clean up. Secondly, we could make sure that it was painless and quick and as humane as possible, and effective as well, rather than having somebody left in a vegetative state from a failed suicide attempt. And thirdly, I think that it would actually provide another layer of safety net for people who are suffering from mental illness, as you mentioned in your video, like somebody who's severely depressed, or people who haven't thought it through properly, or are otherwise suffering from temporarily impaired judgment from perhaps having a bad patch in their life. And whilst this isn't going to catch everybody, there's still going to be the odd spur of the moment suicide, or people who choose not to use the facilities that have been made available. I do think that it would help. If nothing else, it gives people the opportunity to talk about how they feel. Now, I have to say that I do feel that assuming all suicides are related to mental illness is quite a leap, even if you leave terminal illnesses and chronic pain suffering aside. To assume that just because somebody wants to end their life means that their mental judgment is impaired is surely based on the assumption that this way of thinking is somehow abnormal, because most people, if they're given the choice, would choose to live. But deciding what is abnormal in this way is really strolling into a minefield. It wasn't so long ago that homosexuality was regarded in pretty much the same way by both mental health professionals and society in general. And in fact, as my YouTube inbox and the comments on quite a few of my videos will demonstrate, there's still plenty of people around today who feel that gay people are making the wrong choice. So perhaps a healthy attitude towards death, and towards suicide in particular, would be beneficial for everybody. It seems to me that much of the stigma associated with suicide is based largely on the religious teachings that suicide is morally wrong, that it's a sin. So, for example, suicides aren't allowed to be buried in hallowed ground. But if we believe that people should be allowed to live their lives as they please, provided they don't harm anybody else, then I can't see how the same concept shouldn't apply to somebody ending their life. If somebody's contemplating suicide, the advice is almost always an attempt to stop them. And that's quite presumptuous. It assumes that continuing to live is best for that person and that suicide is always a mistake. I think if people were more open about suicide, then they'd be able to discuss it more sensibly. This openness and understanding has got to be better than the recoil of horror that most people would expect to encounter from anybody else if they revealed that they were contemplating ending their own life. Now, I have to admit that I haven't had anybody close to me commit suicide, so my experience is limited and my feelings on this are pretty much hypothetical. But what I do know is that the pain of losing somebody is awful. So to feel that you could have prevented it, that this person was in so much pain that they killed themselves because they didn't have anybody to turn to, that must add hugely to the burden. But that guilt isn't the fault of the person who committed suicide. It's just a natural human reaction that everybody feels when we feel that we've failed somebody we love. Those people who are left behind just feel that they need to take part of the blame. So again, I think that a more open attitude to suicide would help with the guilt. It's not going to help with the pain of losing somebody you love, But I think it's more compassionate to allow somebody to express their feelings and to be sympathetic to them, rather than just simply judging them. And judge them we do, because failed and successful suicide attempts are judged very harshly as selfish and evil acts. Why does society feel that condemnation is justified? If a person genuinely feels that they no longer wish to live, then what gives anybody else the right to try and stop them at all costs? Why is imposing that will on someone, against their wishes, any less immoral than the suicide itself? I certainly hope that, if at some point I decide that my life has reached the point that I no longer enjoy it and I no longer want it to continue, that others would have the decency to respect that decision.